Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you back for part 2, The Election That Ruined Everything, and If It Never Happened, by Alternate History Hub, with a little support from Cypher over at the Cynical Historian. So, last time we had explored this alternate reality where Teddy Roosevelt triumphed over Woodrow Wilson in the election that leads up to our entry into World War I. With Teddy at the reins, we get into the war earlier, and conceivably the war ends a little earlier and under better terms for some of the countries involved, specifically Russia, because not having all that pressure on them towards 1917 and some of the disasters that happened to them in the war up until 1917 means that either they don't get a revolution, which they probably still do, or, as these guys argue, the provisional government in a better position and the Bolsheviks just aren't able to gain enough footing to have the October Revolution to overthrow the February Revolution. So we left off at the end of World War I and the decision regarding Germany's fate. So we'll pick up there. We're a little over halfway through this video, so we'll see how the other half goes.
If Germany was defeated easily militarily and they didn't have to face revolutions or the lack of supplies, there still isn't a way to predict how they would end up. The fate of their future is entirely in the treaty and how they would lose the war, which I can't predict for certain, but there are a few possibilities for how it turns out. So we'll just rush through this. Germany is defeated so badly, they end up losing land and become far smaller than even their post-war borders. The Kaiser resigns and Germany becomes a democratic nation. Germany is defeated just as badly as the first option, but the Kaiser remains in power with his influence greatly diminished, becoming something of a parliamentary monarchy like Britain. Germany loses the borders that it did in our timeline.
Right.
However, the treaty is not as severe. Or, the most extreme option, Germany is completely militarily defeated. The Allies push in and occupy the country just like in World War II. Basically, Germany as a nation doesn't exist for at least a few decades, or until they decide it can be on its own again. This would lead to a lot of colorful debate on which power controls what. Really, there are so many options I could go on. This is what I could predict though, and it all centers around Wilson and Russia. Roosevelt was against Wilson going to the treaty conference in Paris because he believed that Britain, who fought more, should have had more of a say. That opinion easily could have changed if the US fought only 1 year less than Britain, so perhaps he still goes, or at least as a diplomat with his ideals in place.
Right.
The main thing that changes in this timeline isn't the inclusion of Roosevelt, but the absence of Wilson.
Yeah, and that's
Wilson
gonna be
pretty
a
much
big
used
one.
the treaty conference as a way to promote his own worldview, the most infamous of which was, well, the League of Nations.
Yeah.
Austria-Hungary still would collapse, and new nation-states take its
Yeah, the League of Nations. A great idea Wilson had that we ourselves did not participate in. That should say a lot about it right there.
place, just like in our timeline. But for the victors, they would not lose their territory. Russia going forward still remains relatively backwards compared to the West, but it would never see the mass collectivization and famine like under Lenin and Stalin. Oh, which brings me to...
I'm going to take a slight exception to that. They're not going to see the same scale of famine, maybe, but at least the famines during Lenin's period, a lot of those were more based on natural occurrences, drought, so on. There were some issues with collectivization as well, don't get me wrong. Lenin certainly didn't help the situation. Stalin's an entirely different story. The famines during Stalin's period are largely Stalin. Lenin contributed to the famines, like the 1921 famine and so on, but he also reluctantly but did accept foreign help and intervention in alleviating some of those problems. Stalin just doesn't.
The collapse of the Tsar and the failure of the war was the perfect storm to allow such an extremist and violent section of Marxism to take over. The Bolsheviks were the farthest of extremists. They didn't just go after the former autocrats of Russia, but the Mensheviks, less extreme communists, and socialists as well. That iconoclastic, autocratic, and brutal zeal that became the defining mark of communism was birthed from Lenin and his war against anyone he perceived as an enemy of the revolution. Without Lenin, the entire fate of socialism in the West entirely changes, along with the enemy that basically fueled Wilsonianism into the modern day. Without the Bolsheviks, there is no great enemy. The rise of communism was such a series of specific steps, I doubt it would be replicated into the 20th century without Russia. It really was only because of the desperately poor environment in that country that led it to be. That brand of communism simply doesn't arise, left to the history books like anarchism.
Oh, snap.
So both sides, capitalistic and socialist, are less extreme in this alternate 20th century. There is no great war between ideologies, which is what Lenin and Wilson ended up perpetuating in their states. Which is where things actually start getting weird, because a lot of policies were shot down in the West once communism rose, because people rightfully feared it'd lead to a Lenin rising in their country. Which is where I'm going to take a detour.
Okay.
As with anything hypothetical, predictions aren't 100%, just possibilities and an alternate path. And in politics, just because a party or politician wishes to do something doesn't mean they could always do it. Opposition.
That's absolutely true. We do have separation of powers. The president can only get stuff done if he got the support of Congress. Congress is going to struggle to get things done without the support of the president. The Supreme Court can theoretically at least rein in both of them. That's by design, but it can lead to issues.
Always exists, and those outcomes can't simply be predicted. However, if Teddy stayed in office to see the US win the war, this would have been a massive win for the Republicans. They'd have political clout, and potentially could have enacted some new legislation. Teddy, in his first 2 terms, had busted monopolies and created national parks. But he wasn't just satisfied with that. And in the 1912 election, he laid out his goals. A complete overhaul of lobbying in Washington, a registration for lobbyists, and limits on campaign contributions, social insurance for the elderly, a nationalized health service, federal income tax, and an 8-hour workday. The most interesting idea for me is recall elections for those in office and judicial. Say the court makes a decision that the citizens disagree with. It can be overridden by popular vote. If Teddy was in office, it's likely the war would have taken up a majority of his 3rd term. But considering how
Yeah, he did die in 1919, but would he have ended up where he was in 1919 if he had been president? So where was I going with this? Oh yeah, well, after he loses the presidency to Wilson, among other things, he goes on an expedition down into South America along the Amazon, and he gets he comes back pretty ill health due to diseases like malaria and so on that you can get in the tropics like that. I'm not sure exactly what diseases he got. I would assume malaria, among others. I'd have to look it up to be sure, but I know that his eventual death is related to complications from some of the tropical diseases he gets during this period. So if he's president during this period, he doesn't go on that expedition, maybe he lives longer. So that's something else to consider.
His office, he wanted to be in the peace conference, unlike Wilson. I think he, or at least some in Congress, could have gotten a few of these concepts into legislation 100 years ago. In the words of Emperor Tiger Star,
he did it with sanitation, he can do it again.
So since we got that out of the way, I decided this last part will be the fate of Germany in a quicker war is entirely up in the air. However, I think there's one pretty simple answer. Hitler doesn't rise. Now, why do I say that? Hitler's rise to power was not simply him walking into a defeated Germany and saying, he is Führer now. It was just like World War I or Wilson's election, only the result of a string of unique and bad occurrences. The fear of the Bolsheviks was a very real reality for post-war Germany in the 20s and 30s. The Soviets were neighbors to Europe, There had been brief yet failed communist revolutions in 1919 in Berlin and Munich, and just like during the Cold War, in fear of the Reds destroying everything was something in the public conscience. Maybe because that's what the Soviets kept saying they were going to do. While Hitler, yes, rode in on the public fear of the Jews, this also was hand in hand with the fear of the Bolsheviks. But if the war ended in a crushing German defeat, and before the Bolsheviks ever could take control of Russia, those steps that allowed the Nazis to come in power in 1933 become an impossible uphill slope. There simply is no great enemy to fear, and I doubt such a thing as the Reichstag fire would ever have occurred. I really doubt World War II, at least the European war we all know, would have ever occurred. Many wars probably still might happen. Italy, the Balkans are still a thing, but I doubt the Nazis ever rise to power. What else that wasn't Germany? Oh yeah, the federal government would have remained desegregated. Wilson did that. In fact, the history of civil rights in America might have also went down a different path.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Wilson was a big segregationalist. Without him getting in there and segregating the government, things might have ended up different. I don't know how much different, but he certainly didn't help. Like I said in the very beginning of the first video, we're talking about a guy who basically helps to encourage the KKK to come out of hiding and to surge back into the spotlight, so to speak. He encourages white supremacy, not necessarily directly, but in a strong enough indirect manner that he might well be encouraging it directly. Well, I don't know. I think maybe an argument could be made that without Wilson, we don't see quite the resurgence of the KKK. We might not see that resurgence of promoting the Lost Cause myth in the early 20s and going on from there, where we start seeing a lot of more recent statues being put up commemorating Confederate heroes. But do we change the civil rights movement without Wilson? Maybe a little, but I don't know it's going to be a lot. He just kind of emboldened a few of the worst of the worst. I don't know that his presence is going to impact quiet majority, especially of the South, in any way.
Wilson is a complex figure in history. He was a man of startling contradictions. Wilson envisioned liberty as only spreading from a strong central government, or at least a strong central leader himself. Only him, an intellect and orator, could champion democracy through U.S. foreign policy, but in reality it was just advancing U.S. interests under another name. Wilson either purposely or unintentionally misunderstood the world he wanted to change, and create a mindset which didn't reflect that world, or at worst, didn't care to. Even outside Europe, Wilson used his ideology to send the US into Latin America to protect their interests. And it was really because of this that set a precedent in an age where such practices were becoming less acceptable to an isolationist public. The Wilsonian ideal is the one that still dominates the United States. Fighting for democracy in actual true circumstances is a noble one, but ever since its inception, we have to understand it's also been a double-edged sword.
Yes,
one
it
that
has.
can be corrupted into serving ulterior motives under the costume of liberty. It's a reason U.S. foreign policy post-World War II has seemed so contradictory. It ended up overthrowing governments in Latin America and the Middle East. Teddy's old speak softly and carry a big stick style of imperialism was unique. It wasn't colonialism. The US was sick of that after the Philippines. It was more of get in, get out. Wilsonianism was about transforming the country that the US invaded.
Yeah, and the whole idea that we were doing it to make the world safe for democracy, especially during the Cold War period, was in many cases kind of flimsy, because we actually in some cases overthrew democratic governments to install more autocratic ones. Yeah, I think we'll leave discussing that to other videos.
Wilsonianism did replace this old imperialism, but also modified it enough for imperialism to evolve and survive in the next stage of global empire, the battle over ideologies, the Cold War, or now, the battle between West and East. You know how they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Well, our road to hell was paved by mixed intentions. Wilson transformed foreign policy into a holier-than-thou, protector of civilization approach, even when... nah, it wasn't. But guess which one stuck around the longest? Now you may say, Cody, this was 100 years ago. Surely you can't put the blame on the rise of communism, Nazism, foreign endless wars, and the Cold War all on one man's presidency, can you? Yes.
All right, you're welcome. At least he's honest. I don't know if we can put all of it on Wilson, but he has a lot to answer for. But he's just one man. For him to have accomplished everything he did, he had to have support. But we can't put it all on him. All right. That looks like we're pretty well done. I like seeing collaborations like this, by the way. All right. I think we're done. So thank you for joining me on this journey. It was well thought out. The further you go away from the change, however, the more nebulous the discussions get, because you're building each additional block you're building is built on possibilities after possibility after possibility. So the further you get away from that initial change, which is TR instead of Wilson, the further away you get from that, the more you're getting into literal guesswork at that point. Because you're building on blocks that are already guesswork, which are building on blocks that are already guesswork. But for the most part, I think this is well thought out, well reasoned. I have a few concerns here and there, but nothing radical other than, as much as I despise Wilson, as much as the Cynical Historian and a lot of other historians on YouTube do, I don't think we can blame everything bad that happened on him. He had some good ideas. He had a lot of bad ones, but I think they nailed it on the head. He was an idealist whose vision of the world didn't match the real world. And he kind of had this messiah complex where he believed that only he could fix everything, only he could make things better. His ego got in the way. And he certainly had a lot of racist issues. And he certainly said, even though I don't necessarily agree that we're going to change civil rights much if he doesn't win, I do kind of suspect that we won't see quite the resurgence in groups like the KKK as we did under his presidency, especially with TR in charge. Teddy probably wouldn't have put up with that any more than Grant did. So there would definitely be some changes. But how much we can lay at Wilson's feet, I think there's a lot of room to debate all of that. Was he one of our worst presidents ever? I would agree, yes. The absolute worst, I think he needs to be in a conversation for the bottom tier for sure. I know a lot of people would disagree with that. He's often ranked much higher, although his position in the rankings has been going down over the years as people are starting to understand some of the repercussions of his presidency, which is a thing. It takes time to see the repercussions of what a president does. So you've got to be really careful when we're talking about recent presidents. Oh, this guy was the worst president ever. And you hear that right now. You'll hear Obama was the worst president ever, or Trump was, or Biden was. It's way too soon to tell. Now, we can argue that some of the things that any one of those individuals have done may be one of the worst things that's ever happened to this country, from our opinion. But till 40, 50 years pass, we're not going to know all the long-term effects. And sometimes they can surprise you. Sometimes it's something that seems bad to us now may, over time, turn out to be good. And the reverse is often true. Something that seems bad to us now may actually seem even worse than, or something that seems good to us now may turn out to be horrible further down the line when you look at all the repercussions. And that's why when I say alternate history is a thought experiment, the further away you get from where it starts, the more nebulous the discussion becomes. That's part of that idea as well. Anyway, that was a fun experiment. I definitely like anything that tries to show some of the more complicated sides of some of the presidents like Wilson, but this was kind of one-sided. They didn't necessarily look at some of the positive things that Wilson may or may not have done. And there are arguments to be made that he did some good things too, just like any president, even the worst. I'm trying to think of any examples. I'm not coming up with any. But I've rambled enough anyway, so let's just say so long for now. Thank you for joining me. See you next time. Bye-bye.